One of the most fascinating aspects of timbre and its manifestation through orchestration is its ability to create phantom-sounding bodies not actually present in an ensemble. Christoph Penderecki creates a curious aural illusion in his oratorio for Orthodox Easter Eve, Utrenia Part 1, The Entombment of Christ. The massive work, scored for soloists, 2 antiphonal choirs, boys' choir, and orchestra, was composed in 1969-71. In the opening seconds of the 4th movement, we hear the unmistakable sound of a massive cathedral bell, a bell whose timbre sounds particularly Russian rather than European, in fact. However, a look at the score tells us that there is no bell present at this moment. In this presentation, I will first show how it is possible for a perceptual phantom instrument to arise from certain orchestration choices. Next, I will discuss bell acoustics using Hibbert's work in bell pitch perception, and show how Penderecki's 4th movement timbral illusion not only models a bell, but a giant Russian-style cathedral bell rather than a European one, and I will discuss how this relates to the meaning of the oratorio. This discussion can serve as a model for how music analysts might work backwards from a perceived timbral illusion in order to make richer interpretations of music. Penderecki's biographer Wolfram Schwinger states that the composer's intention in this oratorio was to capture not just the content, but more importantly the essence of the Orthodox Slavic rite of Easter Eve. In preparation, Penderecki visited old monasteries in southern Russia, southeast Poland, and Bulgaria in order to find examples of the tradition that had been unadulterated by modern liturgical reforms. One of the obvious ways that Penderecki has brought to life the ancient rite is his use of actual Old Church Slavonic text and chants from the service. If Penderecki intended to evoke the sound of a massive Russian bell, this would be a prime example of how he was able to go beyond text and melody to capture the essence of the rite in a visceral way, as if we are present in the cathedral smelling the incense wafting from the thurible. Bells enjoyed an especially revered, essential position in Slavic religion and culture. In pre-Christian Russia, bells were considered interlocutors between the physical and spiritual realms, and these beliefs continued after the advent of Christianity. According to numerous bell ringers, campanologists, and ethnographers, Russian bells were considered not just instruments, but aural icons of the very voice of God, in the same way that a religious icon is not simply a painting, but a mystical window into the spiritual realm. The 17th century diary of Macarius of Antioch on his travels captures the experience of Russian cathedral bells from a visitor's point of view. The unceasing ringing of bells in Moscow tried the nerves of the Patriarch of Antioch and his son. "Nothing affected me so much," wrote the latter, "as the united clang of all the bells on the eves of Sundays and great festivals, and at midnight before the festivals. The earth shook with their vibrations, and like thunder the drone of their voices went up to the skies. 10 large and small bells hang over each church's gate, which are ordinarily rung successively. Only on Sundays and festivals they ring them all at once with no cessation from midnight to daybreak." In addition to this cultural position of reverence, there are also physical acoustical differences between Eastern and Western style bells. Whereas Western European bells were ground on lathes after casting in order to be tuned to harmonic sonorities, a Russian bell would never undergo such an operation, as bells were considered sentient vessels of anthropomorphic voices, and were therefore prized for their strange inharmonic overlay of complex partials. Russian bells are thicker than Western European bells, cast using different formulas and fixed rather than free swinging. Finally, like the East Asian bells, with which Russian bells share some characteristics and casting traditions, the largest Russian cathedral bells are substantially more massive than the largest Western European bells, which has a profound impact on their sound and audible partials. As we will see, Penderecki's phantom bell is massive indeed. The question of how such a phantom instrument can exist in a piece of music is answered in part by auditory scene analysis, an area of psychological research developed by Albert Bregman and furthered more recently by Stephen McAdams. One of the most basic and important things the mind must do with auditory information is to determine what individual bits of sound must be grouped together. When we hear someone speaking, we are able to make sense of the auditory information because the brain decides that all the individual partials of the voice are of one source and should therefore be fused. Even though none of the partials on its own is voice-like, together they make the sound of a voice. In general, the auditory system only wants to group things together that are truly of one source, like the partials of one voice or those of one instrument. However, it is possible to hijack this system and trick the ear into hearing a group of signals as one entity when really they are many. Bregman calls this an auditory chimera and acknowledges that while natural hearing tries to avoid such errors, music often tries to create them. In order to create an auditory chimera, all of the component signals need to be treated as a unit or fused by the auditory system. One important criterion for fusion is spectral harmonicity. When the auditory system deems a group of partials to be related by the harmonic series, there is a good chance that they will be grouped together as one signal. This is why we hear the individual component partials of speech as one fused entity, since they follow the harmonic series. But the auditory system will also compute the best fit possible for inharmonic input, such as the partials of bells. Another crucial ingredient for hijacking perceptual fusion, and thus summoning a timbral chimera, is orchestrational blend. And we will see in a moment that Penderecki did make compositional choices that would cause instruments to blend and fuse into one entity. When it comes to the question of what data to group into single fused entities, the auditory system also relies on schemas, or stored knowledge of familiar patterns, and it is schema-based processing that makes orchestrated timbral chimeras possible, particularly if the chimeric timbre mimics some sound for which we already have an established schema, such as that of a bell. The clearest example of Penderecki's phantom bell is heard at the beginning of the fourth movement of Utrenia Part 1. "16 brass instruments playing 15 unique pitches, plus a pianist's striking of the lowest string with a mallet, make up the initial harmony. The highest pitch in this dense chord is only a B3. Most of the brass are playing in their very lowest register, creating a result that traditional orchestrators would deem unacceptably muddy. After the initial entrance, the brass instruments slowly morph into microtonal inflections of their initial pitches. Part of why the orchestration works so well to procure this illusion is the soft dynamic. In this muddy, closely positioned range and at this soft volume, every instrument seems to sound like every other, aiding the ability of the individuals to meld into one resonance. Gregory Sandel gives a summary of implicit blending strategies generally put forth in orchestration manuals, highlighting the link between these techniques and his idea of an emergent timbre, which is when the resultant timbre of a group is something completely new and more than the proverbial sum of its parts. Penderecki uses many of these in this moment. Keep instruments in close pitch proximity, choose instruments that share common qualities and keep the number of different instruments low, maximize attack synchrony, and use soft dynamic markings. Of the 17 instruments playing here, 6 are horns, these playing the most densely packed portion of the cluster, and 2 are tubas. Sandel explains that a lower composite centroid from a tone lacking high-frequency information is more likely to blend, and for this reason, dark instruments such as horns are often called for in orchestration manuals when blend is wanted. Based on what we know of orchestrational blend and psychoacoustics, it's safe to say that Penderecki wanted these instruments to blend into one timbre. So, what makes a harmony sound bell-like? Experiments in perception of inharmonic spectra suggest that it is a harmonic series that has either been compressed or stretched by a certain amount. In separate perception experiments by Cohen and Slaymaker, Listeners heard a synthesized altered harmonic signal as bell, chime, or gong-like, both when the partials had been compressed as well as when they had been stretched. We will use the letter S to represent the amount of stretch or compression of partials. When S is equal to 1, we have a perfectly in-tune harmonic series. Slaymaker noted that listeners began to hear the bell effect as S increased past 1.08 and was quite pronounced at 1.26. Similarly, the chime or bell effect was prominent when the partials were compressed to 0.79. Within his own experiment, Hibbert explains that in bells, the upper partials are indeed either stretched or compressed, depending on the shape and thickness of the bell. Here we have the component pitches of Hibbert's example bell, labeled using the names traditionally used in bell acoustics. I've rounded them to the quarter tone and notated them on a staff for ease of reading. The pitches known as P1, 2, and 3 are additional microtonal inflections not usually recorded by bell founders, and we won't discuss them further. Hibbert explains that there are two portions of the traditional bell spectrum which roughly align with the portion of a harmonic series from the second partial upward, labeled hereafter as 2F. One begins on the nominal pitch, followed by the superquint, octave nominal, and finally the I7 and upward pitches. The other portion of the bell spectrum that can roughly align with the harmonic series, again from 2F upward, begins on I7 followed by I9, I11, and every odd-numbered partial thereafter. Hibbert found that either quasi-series can lead to the perceived pitch of the bell by a listener. He showed that it is these upper partials, which he defines as the nominal and upward, that carry the bulk of the pitch perception of the bell, rather than the hum, prime, tierce, and quint. So, it's reasonable to maintain that the upper partials of a bell, from the nominal upward, contain in themselves the timbral nature of bellness, both triggering listeners' learned schema for bells as well as guiding the pitch perception of the signal. This will be important for our discussion because Penderecki's phantasmic bell, if it were real, would be so utterly massive that every partial beneath the nominal would fall beneath the threshold of human hearing. Thus, the quasi-series from the nominal pitch up through the I7 and following pitches is all we have. In this diagram, Penderecki's chosen pitches are shown in ascending order in the top stave, while in the lower stave, what would be the normally tuned harmonic series over A is shown, with partials visually rounded to the quarter tone for the sake of notation. Hibbert's bell pitch names are labeled below. In between the staves, the values for S are shown. S was calculated by dividing each of Penderecki's pitches by the unrounded frequencies in hertz for the A harmonic series. In the phantasmic bell, the nominal pitch would be A0, the piano's mallet strike on the lowest string. The octave nominal is present as a normal A1 and is the only pitch in the cluster which is doubled. It is played both by the second tuba and fourth trombone. Next come the I7 and following pitches. If one examines the pitches Penderecki has used, it might be tempting to at first consider his cluster to be simply a nearly chromatic cluster with no special virtues. However, I think it is better to think of every used pitch as part of one series since they all form one fused timbre. In this case, using Hibbert's bell pitch names, the nominal and octave nominal are normal A's, but the partials above them have been compressed. I have placed the 4 trumpet pitches in a box because they break the pattern. It is also interesting that when listening to this moment, it is the trumpets, if anything, that break the effect, being so bright and loud that they do not blend with the rest of the group. I find the rest of the bell effect so convincing that I believe the better orchestration choice would have been to omit the trumpets entirely and continue the pattern with clarinets, which would have blended nicely with the group and tapered off the volume of the quasi-harmonic series towards the top in a very natural way. With this background on bell acoustics established, let's see how Penderecki's bell compares to real bells. The tables below show Penderecki's bell compared to Sisoy, the largest bell in the Upensky Sobor Cathedral in Russia, and Emmanuel, the largest bell in the Notre Dame of Paris Cathedral. The sound of each of these epitomizes their respective regions' bell casting traditions, with the Russian bell sounding quite percussive and spectrally complex, and the European bell in contrast sounding very harmonically in tune. Recordings of the two bells were analyzed and their pitches categorized according to Hibbert's types. It is when looking at the value of S, the amount that each bell's spectrum has been expanded or compressed compared to a pure harmonic series, that we begin to really see the difference between them. The tables below show 4F, the octave nominal, and upward, until 14F for each, in order to coincide with the amount of pitches in the compressed part of Penderecki's series, thus not including the trumpets. Penderecki's series is compressed, so S values are less than 1, while the Seesaw series is stretched, but they each end up being about the same distance away from the pure harmonic series in either direction. The French bell, on the other hand, consistently has a value for S that is very close to 1 throughout. Therefore, its partials align very closely to a true harmonic series. In summary, Penderecki's cluster not only closely aligns with the model of uniformly altered upper harmonic series that we see in bells in general, but even acoustically seems to model a Russian-style bell rather than a European one, which serves well his goal of capturing not just the content but the essence of Slavic Orthodox Easter Eve in the oratorio. His use of the struck lowest piano string A0, the doubled A1s, and E2 below the cluster proper directly align with Hibbert's nominal, octave nominal, and I8 bell pitches respectively, and clue the ear in to the fact that this is not just a chromatic cluster, but an altered harmonic series over A. Furthermore, after the initial entrance, the brass instruments slowly morph into microtonal inflections of their initial pitches. The joint sound of the slow migration very closely imitates the subtle migration of partials after the initial strike of a Great Russian bell. The strike on the piano's lowest A is also curiously imitative of the spectral behavior of an actual bell strike. A brief period of denser, noisier, short partials precedes the final resonance. When we examine this moment in relation to the text of the piece, it becomes even more astonishing. Directly after the phantasmic bell is sounded, and actually growing out of its resonance, is the one time in the whole oratorio in which we hear Christ speak, "Weep not for me, O Mother," in the Old Church Slavonic, representing a central moment in the Holy Saturday rite. Recalling the Russian veneration of bells as aural icons of the voice of God lends this hearing particular weight. For time's sake, we will forego discussion of other parts of the oratorio, but there is one moment worth mentioning briefly. From rehearsals 9 through 13 of Movement 2, we hear what sounds like a bell, but backwards, beginning with dark, murky resonance and gradually brightening, even becoming more metallic, through careful sculpting of orchestration. This backwards bell is texted, with the voices fully blended into the overall timbre. Here, the people honor Jesus' burial and say, "In your image, you have saved us from decay." If the aural icon of Christ is a great cathedral bell, what better way to portray his saving image projected onto the people than a mirror image of a bell? If we make the same calculations as before, treating the low octave Ds in the contrabass as the nominal and octave nominal, and every pitch thereafter as the I7 and following pitches of an imaginary bell, we do in fact see a value for S that is fairly consistently compressed compared to the would-be harmonic series. This work's companion, Utrenia Part 2, The Resurrection of Christ, gives bells a much more literal and obvious role, including celebratory pealing of dystonic metallic instruments, even falling into repetitive figures reminiscent of Eastern Orthodox swans, or composed out multiple bell ringing patterns used in services. If anything, this seems to bolster the timbral illusion of bells in the first oratorio, because it shows that Penderecki was aware of the use of bells in Eastern Orthodox service. In summary, I have shown how a timbral chimera may be created by manipulating certain aspects of perceptual mechanisms, and working backwards from the chimeric Russian bell in Penderecki's Utrenia have shown why such a hearing is acoustically justified. In this example, not only is a new phantom timbre synthesized, but the new timbre enriches the interpretation of the piece. The effect is not just in the music, but truly in the listener, as it relies on a hijacking of a quirk of the human psychoacoustic system. I have shown how one might use such a perceived timbral illusion as the starting point for analysis, but more generally, I've offered a case study for an interpretive method that seeks first to answer how the music affects a human brain, psychoacoustically, emotionally, cross-modally, viscerally, subjectively, in the moment of listening.